Robert Saleh spoke to the media Monday at the NFL owners' meetings. He offered insight into the Jets' offseason strategy and offered timeframes on the return of a few injured players. We'll talk about what Saleh said and more on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, March 29th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangreneNation.com. Thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit that subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please give this episode a thumbs up. It helps the channel out and it helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Well, Jets head coach Robert Saleh spoke to the media yesterday at the NFL owners' meetings. And if you're a longtime listener, you know that I'm always a bit of a skeptic about what you hear from a coach or a GM or an owner at these meetings, because typically you hear lots of cliches. You don't really get a lot of insight. And that was very true yesterday when Woody Johnson spoke to the media. Really, Woody did not tell us a whole lot that we did not know. However, Saleh, I think, actually gave us quite a few things that were interesting to learn. And we're going to talk about some of those things on today's episode. But the Jets were also active yesterday in free agency. They made a signing. They bring in Solomon Thomas, who was a 2017 first-round pick of the San Francisco 49ers. And I think it's a pick 49ers fans probably regret, because that was the year the 49ers had the second pick. For whatever reason, the Bears traded up from 3 to 2 to draft Mitchell Trubisky. The 49ers got a couple picks in return. They dropped to 3, and they picked Solomon Thomas over Patrick Mahomes. And if you're looking at the quarterbacking question marks the 49ers have, you have to feel like they view that pick with some degree of regret. And part of the reason they probably view that pick with some degree of regret is that Solomon Thomas is pretty much the definition of a first-round bust. Spent last year with the Raiders. He spent the first few years with the 49ers. But this is a guy Robert Saleh probably thinks highly of because, well, first of all, Solomon Thomas was the first draft pick the 49ers made in the Kyle Shanahan, Robert Saleh era. So you have to think that he had quite a bit of sway over that pick. And beyond that, if the Jets are signing him, and this is a player Saleh knows, it's clearly a guy Saleh likes quite a bit. And I thought that there was kind of an overreaction to this signing yesterday. I saw a few people say, well, this means the Jets are out of the running for a defensive end in the first round. And I think we need to calm down a little bit there. I think this has zero impact on the Jets' first-round draft strategy. I don't think that the Jets are going to count on Solomon Thomas to be a starter. He's got under 10 sacks career in 5 NFL seasons. You know, this is not really a guy you're going to lean on in any sort of starting role. In fact, this is not even a guy I think you could say is quality depth. This is just not a guy who's ever been a good player for this football team. And Robert Saleh himself said yesterday, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, even if he had the fearsome foursome, he'd be looking to add another pass rusher. That's just one of his philosophical views. So this is not going to impact the Jets draft strategy. Solomon Thomas is not going to make an impact for this team. Again, Solomon Thomas is probably not even an above-average backup for this team. You know, we use the term depth whenever the Jets sign a player who's not going to be a starter. It's one thing to have depth. I mean, depth means you have players on your roster. Every team has that kind of depth. Solomon Thomas is not quality depth. So why did the Jets sign him? Well, again, it was not to impact their draft strategy. I don't even think they expect Solomon Thomas to be a good player. This is the kind of move you usually see in the first year of a new coaching staff. Not so much the second year, but in the first year, where you're bringing in somebody who kind of knows the system, who know the coaches have worked with in the past. And I feel like the Jets want Solomon Thomas to kind of be, I don't know if an extra coach would be the right phrase, but something along those lines. This is a guy who knows the scheme well. He played for Saleh in San Francisco. He's worked in the scheme quite a bit. And even though you're talking defensive line, it's not going to be quite as complex as what, say, maybe a linebacker has to do. He's a guy who understands what the calls are going to be. He's a guy who's going to be able to help the Jets implement the system. And, you know, the Jets had breakdowns on pretty much every level of their defense last year. So even though this is not the type of move I think you typically see in a second-year coaching staff, it's almost like, and they're going to have a lot of new faces this year, it feels like they wanted to get somebody in here who knows what he's doing in this system. And, even on the defensive line, there could be certain techniques the coaching staff likes players to use, and maybe he can help show some of the other guys how to do those things. And Saleh made a comment at his press conference yesterday that he mentioned that they're looking for guys with kind of high character guys who are going to be good locker room guys. And the fact that the Jets are bringing in Solomon Thomas, a guy that Saleh obviously knows very well, that suggests that they're kind of viewing him as a guy who can maybe help build the locker room a little bit. It's not, I don't think every move you make is necessarily one that's made for what the player brings on the field, because if we're going to be honest here, I think Solomon Thomas brings very little on the field, but I think some of those intangible factors might be the reason that they brought him in here, that they're going to hopefully have him help some other players understand what the coaches are looking for in the scheme. I think we'll see what other player what he can bring as far as, again, teaching guys certain techniques that are maybe preferred in a given situation. That's kind of like the way I view Solomon Thomas signing. It's not going to impact the Jets draft. The Jets are not going to radically alter their draft strategy because they signed a guy with 9.5 career sacks. So every signing does not necessarily need that much analysis, although I've just spent pretty much a full segment here giving it analysis. But sometimes I think we overthink these things. They brought him in because Saleh knows him. They brought him in because they want the help there. And as Saleh mentioned yesterday, it's a thing with him. It's just a philosophical thing. We saw it the way the Jets approached the defensive line last year, the big spending on Carl Lawson, to go with the contract extension John Franklin Myers got early in the season. This is a coaching staff. This is a system. It's a philosophical thing. In fact, Saleh even made a joke yesterday that he and Joe Douglas were going to have a fight over the fourth pick, whether it's an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman, because we know Joe Douglas loves drafting offensive linemen and Robert Saleh always wants to add an extra defensive lineman. And I think that kind of shows you the way the Jets are building. And I think it's something to keep in mind, because there's this perception, which is not really that accurate in NFL fan bases, that the draft is about drafting players at the positions your team is the weakest at. And at the end of the day, that's not really what the draft is all about. Because rookies, you should always take the under on what you're expecting from them. Rookies do not produce in this league. That's just the way it is. You always expect to get immediate contribution. I've heard Jets fans talk about how, we're going to have, since we have 4 picks in the top 40, we'll have 4 impact rookie starters. Even with 4 picks in the top 40, that's a lot to ask. Not only that you're not going to miss any of these picks, because you have to remember, a pick can be a hit even if a player doesn't produce a lot his rookie year. There are lots of guys who don't really produce that much their rookie year, and it's year 2, year 3 where they really step up and take on a big role. I mean, you're talking about maybe the best draft class in the last 5 years in the NFL, even with all these early picks. If you have everybody come in and step in and play at an impact level immediately as a rookie. I mean, even last year's Jets rookie class, which was pretty good, Elijah Vera-Tucker was pretty up and down. Zach Wilson did not have a great year. Elijah Morgan, he was also kind of up and down. Michael Carter had his moments. So that was a good rookie class, and you didn't even get that much impact from it. So it's not really about that focus. It's more about the long run. It's more about, I don't view the draft as something that you fill holes. I view the draft as something that prevents you from having holes in the future, because if you have a guy who's rock solid for your team and you know he's going to be with you for 10 years, then you know that whatever position he plays is not going to be a hole going forward. And I think the Jets very clearly do not want the defensive line to be a hole going forward. They want it to be a strength. They want to add strength to that unit. So I would say we should all calm down a little bit. People are talking about Solomon Thomas as though this is a drastic move by the Jets. It's a move that they're using to fill depth, and I think the expectations for Solomon Thomas should be pretty low. I don't think you're going to get a guy who's a great player, and that's just the way it is. If the Jets want a great player on the defensive line, hopefully Carl Lawson will be back soon. We'll have news on him a little bit later, but they'll also have to draft somebody. The Jets are hoping that they have a great player on the offensive line in Mekhi Becton. They're hoping they signed a great player in Laken Tomlinson. They're hoping they have another great player in Elijah Vera-Tucker who could be developing. And there was news on all of these players that Saleh gave yesterday. So ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'll share the updates Robert Saleh gave on the Jets offensive line as we continue on this Tuesday. Of course, today we are talking about Jets head coach Robert Saleh and what he had to say at the NFL owners' meetings yesterday. It's a sign that we are in the NFL offseason. College basketball, however, has determined the top teams for the Final Four, and this year's national champion will be crowned this coming Monday night. And BetOnline.net is the #1 source for all your sports betting needs and information. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it, BetOnline has you covered. Because BetOnline remains the best spot for all your latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all the league this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. And even though we are in NFL offseason mode, they still have odds for the NFL. In fact, you're not going to like to hear this, or maybe you will like to hear it if you believe in the Jets, but the Jets actually have the longest Super Bowl odds in the NFL at 200 to 1. The odds have gotten worse since the offseason began. Despite all of the signings the Jets have made, the Jets have gone from 125 to 1 to 200 to 1 since the beginning of the new league year. So if you believe in the Jets, that's a chance to make some money. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. Bet online, where the game starts. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And if you like this episode, please give it a thumbs up. It helps other Jets fans find the channel. Yesterday, Robert Saleh spoke at the NFL owners' meetings, and he offered some interesting information. Perhaps the most interesting piece of information that he offered is that the Jets are going to have a little shuffle at the guard position. When the Jets signed Laken Tomlinson a few weeks back, they indicated that Tomlinson was going to play right guard because that's where the Jets had the hole, that's where they had the weakness. It doesn't sound like that's going to happen, though. It sounds like Tomlinson's going to slide in at left guard, and Elijah Vera-Tucker, who had been the left guard last year, is going to move over to right guard. And I say this somewhat ironically because I'm dedicating a whole podcast segment to this, so obviously I'm analyzing it, but this is the type of thing that's very easy to overanalyze. It's the type of thing that's very easy to overthink. I don't think you should necessarily do that. It seems to me like the view is that Tomlinson's played left guard for a long time, so the views on how difficult it is to move from left guard to right guard vary. There are some guys who have done it, and I try to lean on the guys who have actually played in the NFL, because obviously, like anything I tell you about how easy it is to play left guard or right guard, what difference does it make what I have to say? And it seems to me like there's kind of a mixed view on it. There are some guys who have played guard who think it's very easy. There are others who think it's a very difficult transition. I guess it depends on the player, but as far as I can tell, I think what the Jets are thinking is that Tomlinson's been a left guard for a long time, so asking him to kind of shift positions and kind of have to learn how to do everything backwards might be more difficult than it is for somebody like Vera-Tucker, who's less experienced at left guard, so maybe he can be more adaptable, and he's already kind of bounced around a few different positions. Now, I don't think you want to make it a habit of changing Elijah Vera-Tucker's position every year. I mean, to me, like, this means now he's a right guard for the rest of the time with the Jets. Like, that's my biggest takeaway from this, but you knew signing a guy like Tomlinson who's played left guard, where your hole's at right guard, you have Elijah Vera-Tucker who you just traded up for last year, somebody's going to have to move. And originally it sounded like it was going to be Tomlinson. Now it sounds like it's going to be Vera-Tucker. So that's the way the Jets will have their offensive line deployed in 2022. There's also a question about the left and right side when it comes to George Fant and Mekhi Becton. And Saleh reiterated yesterday that he feels that Fant has earned the right to compete for the starting left tackle job based on the way he played last year. That could mean Becton sliding over to the right side of the line. And there's a degree of irony in this because last year when the Jets traded up for Elijah Vera-Tucker, there were many of us who had this dream of the Jets for like the next decade or so having this dominating, mauling left side of their line with Mekhi Becton and Elijah Vera-Tucker playing next to each other, and they were going to completely dominate in the run game side by side. And now that very well may happen. It just may happen on the other side of the line. It may happen on the right side of the line. And, you know, you go back to what I talked about in the first segment, how Saleh made a joke. It was a joke, and it doesn't necessarily mean the Jets are definitely guaranteed. It doesn't necessarily mean the Jets are guaranteed to take an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman with the 4th overall pick. But, again, it kind of shows you the way the Jets view the draft. It's not necessarily that they're going to be focused on drafting at the weakest position, although I definitely think they need to draft a wide receiver in the first round for other reasons that I've already spoken about, and I'm sure I'll speak about again before the draft, is that they're trying to build units into strengths. And the offensive line is clearly a unit Joe Douglas cares about building into a strength. And it'll be interesting to see what the Jets do there, because if the Jets draft an offensive lineman early, that's a sign that at least one of these two guys they don't view as a long-term player. Because, again, the draft's about long-term. And there are questions about both these guys. Becton, who missed the entire season last year, essentially, and Fant, who's entering the final year of his contract and 30 years old. So, this is not the most glaring need right now, but it could be one of those situations if you draft an offensive lineman. It shows that you're being proactive because you're expecting at least one of these guys to not be on your team in 2023. And if that's the case, it gets very interesting to see what the Jets do. Because I think you can totally justify sitting somebody you drafted early his rookie year. In fact, that's something a lot of good teams do, is they'll draft somebody with the idea that they're not going to play year one. They'll have the first year to kind of develop on the practice field and get their game into gear so that they can take over a starting job year two and be able to hit the ground running. But you don't draft somebody to be a backup year two. So if the Jets draft an offensive lineman early, it's a sign that there's not confidence that one of these guys is going to be. And it may not be a complete lack of confidence in their ability to play on the field. It might be a situation where, again, Fant's entering the last year of his contract, where they just don't think Fant fits their future financially, whether they're worried he's going to regress as he gets into his 30s, and maybe they want to go younger at the position. Or again, it could be that Becton is just a guy that they've decided maybe not part of the future. So it'll be interesting to see. And if they don't draft somebody, well, that could also be a sign that they're very confident in these two guys. I mean, Saleh spoke very complimentary of Becton yesterday. Was that coach speak, or was it a sign that, we're expecting big things out of Becton this year? That's something we'll probably find out in the weeks and months ahead as we move toward the draft and past it. But it'll be interesting. It'll also be interesting to see how the Jets handle this competition at left tackle versus right tackle. And I'll say the same thing with Becton that I said with Vera-Tucker. I feel like I understand why they're doing this, and I don't necessarily object to Becton moving to right tackle. I think since the Jets drafted him, there was always a chance his home would eventually move to right tackle. But I feel like the Jets need to make a decision on where he is. And I feel like where he plays this year, that's got to be his home going forward. I don't love the idea of constantly shifting offensive linemen around early in their careers. So I think the Jets need to make a decision on this. And if they make a decision, whatever it is they think is in their best interest long term, then I think you could justify it. Now, they're not sure whether Becton's going to be ready for OTAs. So we'll see about that. We'll monitor that situation. Frankly, I think OTAs, which are the off-season practices, the rules of the league allow you to have so many off-season practices, and these are typically not mandatory, except at the very end of the off-season, there's a training camp. There's a 1-week training camp that is mandatory for players. I think most of the time what happens is, reporters go there and they report that some player looks good and people overreact to it. So I think it's very easy to overreact to OTAs. I'm sure people will overreact if Becton's not ready for OTAs. Robert Saleh indicated that he may not be. I'm not that worried about it. As long as he's ready for training camp, that's the important thing to me. So we'll keep our eyes on that. There's one other player, an important player that the Jets think will be ready for training camp next year. Saleh talked about him yesterday. I'll tell you who it is and why this player is important to the Jets ahead here on this Tuesday episode of Locked On Jets. And as I mentioned, we're going to hear about the status coming up about an injured Jets player as he returns from injury. The Jets are trying to get all of their injured players healthy. And if you need to get your car or truck healthy, you should go to Rock Auto. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. So why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have another option. You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. You should save time and money when using Rock Auto. You should also know Rock Auto's a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and their prices are reliably low for every customer, and they have everything you could possibly need. So go explore their easy-to-use website today to find the solution to your auto parts needs. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck, and write Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need, rockauto.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Tuesday. We are talking about what Robert Saleh said at the NFL coaches meetings yesterday. Saleh offered some interesting insight, far more insight than I usually expect from a coach at an offseason press conference, because most of the time that goes for general managers, it goes for owners. They'll tell you a lot of cliches because they don't want to give away too much about their plan. But some parts of the plan, it doesn't really make a difference. If you're heading into free agency, you obviously don't want to give away who you're going to be looking at, who you're going to be targeting. And the same is true in the NFL draft. You don't want to let another team know you want a prospect because they may trade ahead of you to get the prospect. But there are certain things you can inform us about, like whether Elijah Vera-Tucker or Laken Tomlinson is going to be your left guard and who's going to be your right guard. I mean, that doesn't really impact anything. And Saleh did, I think, give us some pretty interesting insight into a few situations yesterday. And another is just a piece of good news. It sounds like Carl Lawson, the Jets are expecting him ready for training camp. And, I just in the last segment talked about the offseason practices, the OTAs, and I'm a little skeptical that those matter, but those especially matter for players who are still developing. I think that they mean very little for a guy like a Carl Lawson. So I never panic, and sometimes you'll get into a situation where a player's not there because, again, most of these offseason practices are not mandatory. I never worry when there's an established player who's missing the offseason practices. In fact, in some ways, I kind of view it as a positive when an established player misses an offseason practice because a younger developing player then gets those practice reps instead, stepping into their place. So it sounds like Carl Lawson, who, of course, suffered the Achilles injury last year in training camp, will be ready for training camp in 2022. That's a very good sign. I mean, the Jets' defense, you cannot say everything was because of Lawson last year because there's no way Carl Lawson is the difference between a good unit and what we saw last year so frequently. But just the way this scheme was designed, when you're talking about putting John Franklin Myers at the end, having this big defensive line, and really there was only one classic edge rusher on the field at any given point. Because John Franklin Myers, he was good. And he definitely had some great moments last year. I'm not saying he's bad in his role, but his role is not really an edge rusher. He doesn't have the bend. He's a big guy. He's a 290, 300-pound kind of guy. Carl Lawson was really the only guy who could get after the quarterback for the Jets off the edge. The only guy with the type of burst, the type of bend. John Franklin Myers could push the pocket. John Franklin Myers has positive traits, but Carl Lawson was the guy they were really depending on. And when they lost him, they did not have anybody who could replace him. I said it at the time. This was like the most unreplaceable player on the Jets. And hopefully this year they draft somebody early who's got talent, who can maybe offer a bookend and maybe slide Franklin Myers inside more frequently. So maybe it won't be as big of a deal this year, but it was a huge deal losing Carl Lawson last year. The Jets were looking for big things from him, and hopefully he has a full recovery. Hopefully he's back this year. The first step, though, is getting ready for training camp because that will allow him to have a proper preparation for the season, be fully up to speed by the time week 1 comes around, and hopefully on his way to maybe, I don't want to put comeback player of the year type pressure on him, but he's a guy who could make a big difference when he's healthy. He's a guy who's a much better player than the sack numbers would indicate. This is a guy who makes a far bigger impact than those numbers. So good to hear that everything's on track for him. That's all for today's show, however. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoy the show, subscribe to it and leave it a good review. Have a great Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions because tomorrow is our weekly mailbag.